Kakadosh Boker Tov. We're going to be continuing today on Daf Samech, which is Daf 60. However, we're going to start in Nun Tet Amud Bet, right, 59b at the bottom where it starts the Mishnah. The Mishnah is talking about bringing the Korban Pesach not for the sake of the Korban Pesach. So the Mishnah says, "A Pesach shechato shelo lishmo." If you brought the Korban Pesach and instead of bringing it as a Korban Pesach, you are bringing it as a shlamim, as a peace offering instead of a Korban Pesach. Right? And kibel ve'alach ve'zarak shelo lishmo, right? And you did the receiving of the blood or the halacha with the hiluch, right? Which is basically the transporting of the blood to the mizbeach or the sprinkling of the blood on the mizbeach, right? Shelo lishma, also not for the korban pesach, or lishmo ve'shelo lishmo, ve'shelo lishmo ve'lishmo pasul, which means like this. There's a few things that you have to do for the korban pesach. You have to do the actual slaughtering, you have to do the receiving of the blood, and you have to do the taking of the blood and the sprinkling of it. So now, the first case of the Mishnah was, both of them, you did it for a shlamim, for a peace offering, and not for the Korban Pesach. The second case of the Mishnah, which is actually split up into two, is basically that one of them was lishma, and one of them was not. So either, right, the first one is lishmo, which means at the beginning, it was lishma for the Korban Pesach, but then afterwards it was not lishma. Or at the beginning was not lishma, but then at the end it was lishma. But it doesn't matter in any of these cases where you thought that you were going to bring it as a shlamim, as a peace offering, and not a Korban Pesach, it is considered pasul, disqualified. It's not a good Korban Pesach. So keitza lishmo, right? Veshelo lishmo. What does it mean lishma velo lishma? What does that mean? So says the Mishnah, l'shem Pesach l'shem shlamim. Pesach, the Korban Pesach, that's lishma, meaning I'm bringing it as a Pesach, and lo lishma means I'm bringing it as a shlamim, as a peace offering. Shelo lishmo v'lishmo ketzad. How is it not lishma and lishma? So it says l'shem shlamim u'l'shem Pesach. For a shlamim and Pesach, right? That's shelo lishma and then lishma. So if it was going to be lishmo v'shelo lishmo, meaning for the sake of the Korban Pesach and not, so at the beginning you thought of the Korban Pesach, then you thought of it as a shlamim. If it was the other way around, lo lishma and then lishma, which means not for the sake of Korban Pesach, and then it means that you thought of it as a shlamim and then as a Pesach. Okay, so that's a Mishnah. Okay, says the Gemara, Bayir of Papa. Rav Papa comes and he asks the following question: Ba'avoda achat tnan, or bishte avodot tnan? Our Mishnah, where the Mishnah is saying that the Pesach is going to be pasul, when you thought of it lishmo v'shelo lishmo, are we talking about it that was in the same avodah, which means, for example, in the same shechita, the same slaughtering, or the same of the receiving of the blood, or the same of the transporting and the sprinkling of the blood? Or are we talking about in the exact same action you thought lishma v'shelo lishma, or bishte avodot tanan? Or we're talking about there were two separate actions. So, for example, in the shechita, I thought one thing, and then in the receiving of the blood, or the sprinkling of the blood, I thought something else. So, says the Gemara, we're going to try to explain. Right? Do we say that it's all in one avodah? Rabbi Yosehi, and it's Rabbi Yosehi. Because according to Rabbi Yoseh, a person is going to be held accountable even for the end of his words, and all his words is going to be good, which means that the Pesach is going to be disqualified. Why? Because even though you started it with a good intention, the fact that in midway you switched it, it becomes disqualified, and therefore it's even in the same avodah, in the same service. And it's according to Rabbi Yosef. But if it's going to be Rabbi Meir, Hamar Tfos Lishon Lishon, right? Lishon, which means he always says you go after the beginning. Meaning, if I'm going to start the Shechita and I say I'm doing it for the Korban Pesach, even if in the middle of the Shechita I'm going to start thinking that it's going to be for something else, it doesn't matter. Right? Samech Amud Aleph 68:1, this is today's daf. Or Dilma, or maybe Bishte Avodot Tnan. Maybe we're dealing with two different avodot, which means one avodah was a Shechita, one avodah was the, let's say, the receiving of the blood and then the sprinkling of it. But we're talking about two different ones, right? And that's why we said that you thought one good thing and one bad thing, or one bad thing, one good thing, meaning lishma v'lo lishma, right? And this is going according to Rabbi Meir, that he says that you go after the first of your languages, that's only in one. But if it's going to be two separate avodot, he's going to agree that it's going to become disqualified. So says the Gemara, Amri Ahai, on which cases was the safek of Rav Papa? If you're going to tell me that you started bad and then you made it better, which means you started shelo lishma and then you made it lishma. So then 1 second, ben b'avodah achad b'shtei avodot, doesn't matter whether it's the same avodah or two different avodot, whether according to Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yosef, it's going to become silim mikamaita, it's going to be disqualified. But since you started off wrong, that's it, there's nothing more to talk about. Right? Tehal Rabbi Yosef nami, af begmar dvarav adam nitpasitle, right? Af, right? So he says over here that so according to Rabbi Yosef, he also holds of the concept that a person is going to be accountable also at the end of his words. Ela lishmo v'shelo lishmo, but rather it had to be the other way around. It had to be that you started off well. You started off by saying it's lishma for the Korban Pesach, and then you had to switch it to become disqualified. So tashema, my what's halacha? So tashema, we're going to try to bring a proof. Ha Pesach sheshechato shelo lishmo. What happens if you brought the Pesach at the beginning? You started lo lishma. So not for the Pesach. You were going to bring it as a peace offering, shlamim. V'kibel v'alach zerak shelo lishmo. And then you also did everything, also lo lishma. You accepted the blood, you took the blood, and then you sprinkled the blood. So hechi dami. What's the case? If you're going to tell me it's all the same thing, vav, right? V'kibel v'heilech v'zarak, right? And everything was the same thing. Lama li demechshev lekulu. Why does he have to start? Why does he have to mention everything? Right? From the beginning, it already became disqualified, which means if you're going to tell me that you always go after the beginning, the second that you did the shechita wrong, kaddish. The second that you did the shechita for a shlamim and not for a pesach, you finished. That's it. There's nothing what to do with it afterwards. Ela la, but rather, hachikdan. This is what it means to say. Ha pesach shechechato shelo lishmo. The pesach that you started it not lishma. Or you slaughtered it lishma, but you received the blood and you transported it lo lishma. Or you slaughtered it and you received the blood and you transported it, but you didn't throw the blood, lishma. That's considered two avodot. That in one of them you thought lishma, another one you thought shelo lishma. So ema seifa, let's say the seifa then. Lishmo v'shelo lishmo yechidami. What's the case that you thought at the beginning lishma, not lishma? If you're going to tell me it's two avodot, so then that's the beginning part, that's the former part of the Mishnah. Ela la has to be in one avodah. And it's going to be Rabbi Yosef that he says that that a person will always be held accountable, even for the end of his words, which means that even in one avodah, even in the same service, whether it's the same shechita, the same receiving of the blood, the same thing, in one avodah, you're held accountable to your latter words. So says the Gemara, no, lo, leolam b'shtei avodot. Really, we're talking about two avodot. What does that mean, two avodot? The first one you thought lishma, and the second one you thought shelo lishma. V'reisha dekai b'shchita v'kamechashev b'shchita. So the reisha we're talking about shechita. So therefore that's why we're dealing with the entire concept of the shechita. Inami kai b'zrika, or we're talking about zrika, which is the sprinkling of the blood, and that's what we're talking about. Dekai b'shchita v'kachashi b'zrika. However, though the seifa though is talking about that you did the shechita and then you did the zrika. There were two different things. Damar, but he says, I am doing the shechita for the Korban Pesach, lishma, but the sprinkling of the blood is not lishma. So it comes to teach you, that we do go from one avodah to another avodah, and then what happens is that's the question of Rav Papa. So it comes out that according to we're just answering up the safek of Rav Papa, that we do go from one action to another action, which means one service to another service, and it will actually negatively impact the entire service, which means even though you started the shechita properly, if afterwards you went and you did the zrika not properly, you completely disqualified the sacrifice of the Korban Pesach. Okay? Until here we're clear?
Yes.
Very good, thank you. So Tashema, now we're going to try to bring another proof, another explanation of how to explain, right, our Mishnah. O shelo lishmo v'lishmo pasul. What is the case where you started lishmo, shelo lishma, which means not for the Pesach, and then you did a lishma? So hechi dami, what's the case? Inema b'shtei avodot. If you're going to tell me it's two different services, hashta lishmo v'shelo lishmo amarta pasul. If you're right now by lishma v'shelo lishma, you already told me it's pasul. Shelo lishmo v'lishmo b'aisa. So meaning everyone agrees that if you started off wrong, it's much worse. Meaning at least if you started well, so then okay, fine. In the middle, something went off. Okay, but at least you started it properly. But everyone agrees that if you started it off wrong, you started on the left foot, the entire rest of the thing is going to start on the left foot, right? That happens with everything in life. If you're going to start a recipe well, and then in the middle you go off. Okay, in the middle you go off, right? But if you started off, it's much more difficult to try to bring it on before. You understand? It's much more difficult. So you're going to tell me now that when we're going to talk about shelo lishmo v'lishmo, right, is going to be a question, right? So it says over here, what happens is that like this. It says, really we're talking about one avodah. So since we're talking about in the Seifa, in the latter part of the Mishnah, one avodah, so the Reisha also is talking about one avodah, which means that according to him, he wanted to say that since right now in the Seifa we're talking about one avodah, so in the Reisha we're talking about one avodah. Okay? So says the Gemara, and that's going to be like Rabbi Yosef. So he says, Lo Lo'olam b'shtei avodot. Really, we're talking about two separate avodot, two separate works. Uvdinu delo yitzlich le, but really, we don't need to mention it. V'ida d'tanin lishmo v'shelo lishmo, taninami shelo lishmo v'lishmo. But you're right. But it was derech agav. It was by the way, which means since we already taught in the case lishmo v'shelo lishmo, which means it was for the sake of Korban Pesach and not for the sake of Korban Pesach. We also taught the other way around. But really, you're right. We didn't need to teach it, because it's obvious, but we wanted to do it anyway. We did it derech agav. Sometimes you do it by the way. By the way, you're already mentioning it. Okay, so I'm already going to say the entire thing, even though you don't really need to do it. So Tashema, we're going to try to bring a proof, right? Shechato shelo leochlav. Imagine right now you went and you slaughtered it for people that were not supposed to eat it. For example, for a choler or zaken. Veshelo limniyav. Yeah, which basically means these people, they cannot even eat a kazait of it. The guy's sick, or he's an elderly. He can't even eat the kazait of the Korban Pesach. Or you went, right, and you slaughtered it, shelo limnuyav. Shelo limnuyav means not for the people which are designated to eat from it. Remember that we mentioned in the korbanot, yeah, Alush will tell you, yeah, that what do we mention in the korbanot? We say, V'eno nechal ela limnuyav, V'eno nechal ela tzali. And then Rabbi Yishmael Omer, what does that mean? The Korban Pesach, right, has to be eaten ela limnuyav, for the people which are designated for it. Which means, imagine right now, I was making the Korban Pesach. And after doing the Korban Pesach and everything, I go and I say, you know what, Baba Haki, come to my house to eat. So the halacha states, doesn't help. Why doesn't it help? Because it has to be limnuyav, which means that at the time of the Korban Pesach, I already have to designate who's going to be there, who's going to be eating for my Korban Pesach. It has to be a designation, right? So that's what it says here, V'shelo limnuyav, which means that they didn't do it for the people which are there, on the same chabura. Or you started it for arelim, for people that weren't done a brit milah. So if you have a person that wasn't done a brit milah to him, and then they're going to come and they're going to give him a korban pesach. Now remember, a person that's an arel, lo yochal, he's not allowed to eat it. Veli tmein, yeah. Or for tmein, what does it mean tmein? It says over here for somebody that's tameh. We know that somebody that's impure is not allowed to eat the korban pesach. Pasul. All these cases, it's going to be pasul. So hacha pshita b'avodah achat. Here, obviously, we're talking about in one avodah. We need the seifa b'avodah achat. So since we're talking about in the seifa one avodah, reisha nami one avodah. So to the reisha, we're also talking about one avodah. Yeah. So he comes and he says, yeah, reisha nami b'avodah achat. So says the Gemara, midi idia. Can you compare both cases? Hakirita. Each one is a separate case. Seifa is talking about one avodah. The Reisha is talking about either or. Meaning the Reisha, you're right, it's one service, the Shechita. But the Seifa could be not only Shechita, it could be Shechita, it could be Zrika, it could be the Alicha, it could be whatever you want. Okay? So Tashema, we're going to try to bring another proof. Leochlav v'shelo leochlav. It says for the people that are eating it or not eating it. Hechi kasher, it's going to be kosher. Hechi dami, what's the case? If you're going to tell me he's talking about two separate avodot, so why are we going by zrika? De'en machshevet, right? Ochlin bizrika, but there's no machshevet ochlin in zrika. Habavodah achat kegon b'shchita. Temehanya be. When we're talking about one avodah, that there is going to be shchita, that it does help, right? Machshevet ochlin pasul, it should be pasul. V'kaimena we paskin miktzat ochlin no pasla, right? That if it's going to be miktzat ochlin, part of the ochlin, it's not going to be make it pasul. Yeah, that means if it's only going to be, that's what it says over here. If it's only going to be a few of the people, which means, right, some people were minuyim and some people were not, but you did it for everybody, so you're not going to disqualify, because at the end of the day, it was done for some people that you were going to do it for, that they were going to partly eat it. Elalav, so says Daf Samech Amud Bet, Elalav b'avodah achat, really we're talking about one service, right? One avodah. Only the seifa avodah achad. So since the seifa started, the latter part of the Mishnah is talking about one avodah, so to the Reisha is also talking about one avodah. So says the Gemara Midiyah. Can you compare both cases? Hakirita. Each one is separate. The seifa is talking about one avodah, and the Reisha is one avodah or two avodot. It all depends. Okay. So ask the Gemara. So they're going to ask now the following question. Pesach shechato b'shar yemot hashana lishmo v'shelo lishmo. When you have a korban pesach that they slaughtered it during the rest of the year, right? Which means, let's say before the 14th of Nisan, they come and they did it lishmo v'shelo lishmo, right? That means for a korban pesach and for a shlamim. Ma'u hatzalacha. Mi'ati shelo lishmo ma pikle midi lishmo machshir or lo? Do we say that the shelo lishmo is going to take it out of the lishmo and therefore it's going to make it kosher or not? Which means, obviously, we know you can't do a korban pesach right today. Imagine right now we had the Beit HaMikdash, Bezrat Hashem, speedily in a days, right? Do you think right now you could bring a korban pesach? Obviously not. So imagine you brought it as a korban pesach, right, at the beginning, and then you switched in the middle, that now it's a shlamim. So do we say that the switching in the middle now takes out from the korban pesach, and now it's going to make it kosher? Or do we say, no, since you started it bad, that's it? That's the question. Everyone understood the question, yeah? That means basically you thought of doing it as a korban pesach today, and then you switched it in the middle to a shlamim. Do I say that take it out of the korban pesach and now it's kosher, or do I say it's disqualified because you thought of it as a korban korban pesach? So kiata Rav Dimi Amar. So when Rav Dimi came, he said, Amar Amrita lishmata kemed Rabbi Yirmiyah. So he comes and he said this in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Hoil velishmo machshiro bizmano, veshelo lishmo machshiro shelo bizmano. Since we say that when it's going to be lishmo, it's going to be machshiro bizmano. It's going to help it bizmano. Veshelo lishmo, if it's not going to be not lishmo, machshiro shelo bizmano. It's going to be make a kosher not bizmano. Ma lishmo machshiro bizmano en motziyeh mideh shelo lishmo. Just like if you did it lishma, it's only going to be machshir ze bizmano, but it's not going to take it out of the lo lishma. So too, when it's not nishma, it's going to be machshiro shelo bizmano. It's not going to take it out of lishmo pasul, and it's going to be pasul. Which means, just like in a normal case on Erev Pesach, the lo lishma does not make it, the kosher does not take it out of the not kosher, right? Which means that's what it says here. Shelo lishmo, the shlamim is not going to make it kosher shelo bizmano. So too here, the lo lishma is not going to take it away from the lishma. It's going to be disqualified. Which means that the second that you thought it was for a Pesach, Kaddish. Why? You're in the middle of the year. It doesn't help as a korban Pesach. But he told me, no, it's incorrect. Why? Lo lishmo helps by all the other zevachim. Tomar lishmo, is that going to help by lishmo? That's only by Pesach and not by the rest of them, right? Which means, right, the psulo is much lighter. So therefore, it could be that's why it helps the lo lishma to take it out. Which means if you started it as a korban Pesach, and then you had a lo lishma afterwards, the korban pesach is so strong, right, that what it does is that it actually takes it out of the korban pesach. However, though, usually by other sacrifices, which is not the same thing, right, it's not that light to take it out. So my haviyala. So what's be'emet halacha then? So Amar Rava comes and he says, Pesach shechato b'shar yemot hashana lishmo v'shelo lishmo kasher. It's going to be kosher. Why? That means if you did it throughout the year, let's say today, and you started it as a korban pesach, and then you switched it as a shlamim, it's kosher. Tehastamo lishmo kai bestama, it's going to be lishma, which means it was nishchat stam, right? Ve'afilu achi kishach, still when you were doing it, shelo lishmo kasher, it's still going to be kosher. Alma ati shelo lishmo papikle lishmo, so it does take it out. So kishachi na min lishmo v'shelo lishmo. So when you did the shechita, even though when you started the shechita, you did it as a pesachim, and then you switched it. Ati lo lishmo, papikle lishmo, it's going to take it out. So it does take it out. Okay? So Amar le Ravada barava le Rava. Says Ravada barava to Rava. Dilma shane hecha de amar mehecha de lo amar. Maybe it's different if you said it from a place where you didn't say it. Teha le'ochlav v'shelo le'ochlav kasher. If you did it for somebody that's going to eat the korban pesach, and somebody that's not fitting to eat the korban pesach, for example, an elderly or a sick person, it's still going to be kasher. But if you only did it for people that they cannot eat it, then it's going to be pasul. Why? For sure you did it for people that are going to eat it. But it's different because you said it when you didn't say it. So to here, it's different if they said it or they didn't say it, which means if right now, right, you said something mefurash, so then it's much worse if you didn't say it. If you didn't say it, you probably were doing for a few people. And therefore, it wasn't only just for a sick person or whatever that they can't eat it. So therefore, it's going to be kosher. But sometimes it's going to be done that it's completely disqualified. So then it's different. So Amalei, so he comes and he answers, Midi Idia, can you compare both cases? Bishra Mahatam, I understand over there, Kama de lo akale b'shchita, as long as you didn't say it mefurash from the shchita, stam vida lishmokai. For sure, it's going to be lishma. Elahacha, but here, stam leochlav kai. For sure, it's going to be the people eating it. So dilma mimshechehani. Maybe it could be that these people are minuim there right now. And other people are going to join you. The Tanam, we learned in the Mishnah, nimninu moshchin etidehem imenu. They could come and they could point people on the Korban Pesach, and also they could put other people, right? I mean, until the shechita, which means that until the time of the shechita, they're able to come and to separate, right? And they're able to do that. So therefore, you see from here that this machshava is the entire thing, shelo lochav, and therefore it's going to be disqualified. But if you did think at the beginning for the people that are going to eat it, and then afterwards shelo lochav, so then it's lochav and shelo lochav, and therefore it's going to be kosher. So we can
do the shchita for a vegan on Pesach?
As long as it's going to be for other people as well. Because remember, it has to be le'ochlav and shelo le'ochlav. And by the way, remember, a vegan, he's allowed to eat meat, right? It's just that he doesn't want to eat meat. Here, the sick person or the elderly
they
person
cannot
not eat the meat. So it's a little bit different. Yeah? You have to know that. So ask the Gemara, so now they're going to ask the following question. Pesach sheshachto b'shar yemot hashana b'shinui ba'alim. Imagine you have the Korban Pesach that they slaughtered it throughout the year, right? B'shinui ba'alim. B'shinui ba'alim means not for the ba'alim, but not for the owners, but for another owners. Ma'u what's halacha? Shinui ba'alim is like shinui kodesh dami. It's like you're also changing it, not lishma. Umach shile, and therefore it's going to be kosher, right? That means basically it's going to make it kosher, or maybe not. So Amar Rav Papa says Rav Papa, Amrita lishmaita kamed Rava, right? We said this in front of Rava. Hoil v'shinui kodesh poslo, right? Bizmano v'shinui ba'alim poslo bizmano. Since shinui kodesh is going to disqualify it in the proper time, and shinui ba'alim is also going to disqualify it in the proper time. Okay, so ma shinui kodesh sheposlo bizmano. Just like shinui kodesh, it's going to be posel bizmano. Machshiro la'achar zmano. It's going to make it kosher la'achar zmano. So to shinui ba'alim sheposlo bizmano. Machshiro la'achar zmano. So to shinui ba'alim that it's going to disqualify it bizmano. It's going to be machshir et zeh, right? La'achar zmano, after the time. Fa'amal yeni said, lo, no. Im amarta b'shinui kodesh, when are we going to say that this is by shinui kodesh? Shekem psulo begufo. That's going to be begufo. Yeshno arba avodot, and there's going to be 4 different avodot. Okay, which means, what does this mean that there's going to be 4 avodot? Right? It says over here, shinui kodesh, right, is going to be, it's psulo begufo, it's in the actual gufa korban, it's in the actual korban in itself. And there's going to be 4 avodot, because you have the shchita, the kabbalat adam, the slaughtering, the receiving of the blood, the taking of the blood, or zrikat adam, right, which is the sprinkling of the blood. Since there are 4 different services, right, which could actually make it pasul, it's a completely different halacha. V'yeshno la'achar mita. Let's try to get into the Mishnah, Samechalaf Amud Aleph. Yeah? V'yeshno la'achar mita. And there's also going to be after death, right? That means if they consecrated the korban and then they died, right? So whoever is going to inherit it will actually bring it. So if they did the shchita of the korban, right, it's not going to help them. V'yeshno betzibur v'kiv'yachid. And it's going to be, that means also korban tzibur is going to become pasul b'shinui kodesh. Tomar b'shinui ba'alim. It's not like by shinui ba'alim. Dem psulo begufo. Ve'eno be'arba avodot. Ve'eno la'achar mita. Ve'eno tzibur kiv'yachid. Which means we are trying to bring the differences between shinui ba'alim and shinui kodesh. Shinui kodesh means you change something in the holiness, which means in one of the 4 sacrifices, in actual gufa korban, in actual korban in itself. Now this, right, to do with the thing, it's only going to be, right, that shinui ba'alim, if it's just that the owners changed, meaning there was a change in ownership in between, you don't have all these things. The psul in the body, the four services, after death, tzibur like a yachid, but you do have it by regular korban pesach or things like that. Now, even though we just said 2 out of the 4, right? He says tarte miya davka, but 2 of them still is davka. So therefore, there are 2 good questions. Meaning, even though 2 out of the 4 are not good questions, right? But still, 2 are still good questions, right? Because we said at the beginning, right? We said He says it wasn't going to be the same thing. Yeah, so he comes and he says as follows. So he says, so the Maishna, the Gemara is going to explain what does that mean. The Maishna shinui ba'alim psulo begufo. Why is it that shinui ba'alim is not a psul in the body? Why is it that if you change ownership, it's not considered a psul in the actual body of the sacrifice? He says the psulo machshava be'almahi, because the psul is only in the machshava. Shinui kodesh nami psulo machshava be'almahi. It's also only in machshava. It's also only in the mindset. It's not in anything in the body. It's in your mind. Did you do anything different in this sacrifice? It's the exact same sacrifice. It's only in what you thought in your brain. The two, and furthermore, that you just said that shinui ba'alim is not after death. Yes, there is. What are you going to say? So because of that, we said that two of them, there's a good question against them. Number one, why is it a psul beguf? At the end of the day, it's the exact same thing. It's b'machshava. It's in your mind, just like the shinui ba'alim. And the second one was, what about according to this shita of Pinchas, the son of Rav Ami, that he said that there is shinui ba'alim achamita. So you can't prove to be these two, but you still have the other two. That means you still have two different proofs against that shinui ba'alim is not as strict as shinui kodesh. So tartamia davkaninu, you still have the two of them. Ela, but rather amarava pesach sheshachto b'shal yamot Hashem shinui ba'alim nasa kimi shelo ba'alim bizmano pasul. So it comes out that if you're going to slaughter a korban pesach, right, during the rest of the year, the shinui ba'alim not for the owners. So it's like keilu that it doesn't have owners in the proper time, and therefore it's going to become disqualified. And then we get to the Mishnah on, right, Daf Samech Aleph Amud Aleph. So it continues the Mishnah on Samech Aleph Amud Aleph 61a. Says the Mishnah, Shechato shelo leochlav. Imagine right now you take the Korban Pesach and you slaughtered it not for the people that are eating it. Again, remember, somebody that couldn't eat it. It means that he's sick or he's elderly. They can't even eat a kazait of it. V'shelo limuyav, or for people which were not appointed to actually take part in it. Larelim, for people that did not have a brit milah, circumcision. Litmin, people that are impure. Pasul, it's going to be disqualified. Leochlav v'shelo leochlav. Limuyav v'shelo limuyav. Lemulim v'le'arelim. Litmin v'letorim kasher. However, if you're doing it for both, it's going to be kosher, which means also for people eating and not eating, people that are designated and not designated, people that have the brit milah and not the brit milah, and tameh and tahor, it's going to be kosher. Shechato kodem chatzot. If they did the shechita before chatzot hayom on erev Pesach, it's going to be disqualified. Pasul b'shum shneimar, but it says in the pasuk ben ha'arbaim. It has to be in the afternoon time. Shechato kodem tamid. If they also slaughtered it before the korban tamid, it's still going to be kasher. Which means even though we already learned, if you remember, yesterday, the day before yesterday, that you always did first the tamid and then the korban Pesach. If they did it the other way around, it's still going to be kosher. As long as somebody else is mixing, right, the blood of the korban Pesach. Right? Until you're going to sprinkle the blood of the Korban Tamid. However, though, but if they did sprinkle the blood of the Pesach before the Korban Tamid, it's also going to be kosher b'diavad. Okay? Which means that even if you did bring the Pesach before the Tamid, make sure that you have somebody mixing the blood so it doesn't congeal. And then somebody else is going to do the Korban Tamid. They finish the Tamid, they sprinkle the blood, and then you sprinkle the blood of the Pesach. Says the Gemara. Tanu Rabbanan, we learned in the Braita. Keitzat shelo leochlav. What does it mean shelo leochlav? People that cannot eat it. L'shum chole or l'shum zaken, for a chole or zaken. Ketzad, right, a sick person or an elderly person. What is l'shelo li'mnuyav? You had to do it for this chabura, but you did it for another group. But it wasn't for the wrong group. Yeah? How do we know these words? The Tana B'Rambam, we learned in the Braita, b'michsat nefashot. What does it mean b'minyan nefashot? Melamed she'en ha'pesach nishchat le'mnuyav. The korban pesach has to be slaughtered for the people which are designated to eat it. I would have thought that if you're going to slaughter it for those people, it's like you're just going against the mitzvah, but it's still going to be kosher. The Torah is telling you it impedes. That if you don't do it, it impedes. It's not just stam that lechatchila. No, if you didn't do it, then that's it. It doesn't work. Rabbi says the word tachosu is lashon aramit, and it means tishchatu. You have to slaughter it. Just as he says, slaughter me this thing, which means that it's teaching you that during the time of the shechita, you already have to have in mind who are the limnuyav, who are the people that are designated to eat it. So ashkechan shelo limnuyav. I understand shelo limnuyav, because we just learned it. The miksat nefashom melamed that it has to be limnuyav. The minyan nefashom. The miksat nefashom means the minyan, the amount of people. Okay, but what about shelo leochlav? So Amarka, it says in the pasuk, ish lefi ochlo tachosu. Each person according to his eating it. Ish lefi ochlo, the way that he eats. So as we somebody that's fitting to eat, a kazait. Eat kashochlin leminim, which means that there's a juxtaposition, there's a kesh, close proximity between the ochlin and the mnuim, the ones that are eating it and the ones that are designated to eat it, which means that it has to be the same thing. Samechalaf amubet 62b. Shechato lemulin, if you did the shchita for the mulin, which means for the people that they did brimilaz, right? Al menat shikapru bo arelim bizrika, in order that they should have a kapara for the people that are arelim. Arelim means that they did not do the brimilah bizrika. Rav Chasta says it's going to be pasul, and Rabba says it's going to be kasher, which means that's something very interesting. You had in mind to do the shechita only to give it to people which have brit milah. Okay, that means on the shechita it was kosher, but then afterwards, in the middle of the shechita, you thought that there should be a kapara for the arelim in the zrika. In the actual, that means the shechita was done properly, but in the zrika, in the sprinkling of the blood. So Rav Chasta says it's disqualified. Rabba says it's kosher. Rav Chasta says it's going to be disqualified. Yesh machshevet arelim bizrika, because there does exist such a thing on the zrika itself also, that it's going to disqualify even in the sprinkling of the blood. Rabba says it's kosher because there's no machshevet arelim, right, to do with zrika. It doesn't help. So Amar Rabba wants to bring a proof. Menam, how do I know this? To tell you, we learned in a braita. When it says v'chol arel lo yochal bo, it means anybody that does not have a brit milah done to himself, he's not allowed to eat from the korban pesach. I would have thought that it's going to come and disqualify the bnei chabura which are coming with him, and it's a dinu and it's kavachomer, right? Hol ve'orla poselet, just like if right now the arelim, it's going to disqualify the tuma poselet, and also tuma disqualifies, impurity disqualifies, just like tuma lo asaba mitzat tuma k'chol tuma, just like over there, there's not part of the tuma as the entire thing tameh. So to orla lo asaba mitzat ola k'chol ola, we're not going to disqualify for partially, because at the end of the day, here you have arelim and you have not arelim. So therefore, you should say that it's going to be kosher. Or klach lederech zu, maybe I'm going to go the other way around. Hoil ve'orla poselet, since orla, that means if people don't have brit milah, it does disqualify. Uzman posel, and also if you wanted to bring it outside of the proper time, which is called pigul, it also disqualifies, right? Mazman asabak miktzat zman kechol zman, just like the zman, partially, even if you had one in mind just one kazai to eat outside the proper time and becomes pigul, so to orla, even if it's going to be for one person, right, that you wanted to do it, it's going to disqualify. Which means that we're trying to compare it, that just like it's going to disqualify for a minor amount, it's going to disqualify for everything. So says the Gemara, nireh lemi domeh. Who's it more compared to? Danin davar she'eno noeg b'chol azvachim, mi davar she'eno noeg b'chol azvachim. Are we going to come and say that we're going to try to judge something which is by all the korbanot, so something which is all the korbanot? Ve'al yochichu zman, and don't bring me a proof from pigul, from time, because that's by all the korbanot. Or maybe the other way around. Danin davar shelo utar miklalo, b'davar shelo utar miklalo. Maybe I'm going to judge something which is not permitted part of it to something which was permitted part of it, right? Which is basically the time frame. But don't prove to me tuma, because tuma is permitted in a certain circumstances when tuma utra b'tzibur, when the entire tzibur are tmeim, they're allowed to bring a sacrifice betuma. So you see from here, there does exist such a thing. So it says the Gemara, Tamulomar comes teach you zot chukat pesach. And then what does it say? My zot, what does it mean zot, the word zot? This. Ilema dechula ola posla. If you're going to tell me that a machshava only for everybody, which is arelim, is going to be posel, mikzata lo pasla, but if it's going to be few of them, it's not going to disqualify. Haimim v'chol arel nafka. You already learned that from the chol arel, and any arel, all the arel. Elalav, rather, comes teach you achik tamul mar v'chol arel, kula ola posla, mikzata lo pasla. The entire thing is going to disqualify, but not part of it. And if you're going to tell me the same halacha would apply to the sprinkling of the blood, tekula or la miat pasla, because the entire thing is going to disqualify it. Tamulomar comes teach you zot. What is zot? Shchitahu dekula or la miat pasla. It's only going to be the shchita that it's going to disqualify it. Aval zrika afilu kula or la nami lo pasla. Even if everyone, that means by the shchita, even if part of it. And even if I'm going to think about a few people that they're not going to be done brit milah to them, and I have in mind them, it disqualifies. But by the zrika, even if everybody is going to be arelim, which means that they didn't have a circumcise, right? It's also not going to disqualify it. If I'm going to say, my kula de zrika, why is zrika much more lenient than shchita? The en machshavet ochlim is zrika, but there's no machshava of ochlim by zrika, which means only when you're doing shechita are you thinking about eating. When you're doing the sprinkling of the blood, what does it have to do with the eating? So that's why the zot comes to teach you. For Rav Chasta, and according to Rav Chasta, Adarabba, the opposite. Leidach kisa, go the other way around. Tamulomar vechol arel, kula or la posla. Everything is going to disqualify by orla. Miksata lo pasla, but a little bit of it is not. But by zrika, even miksata, it's going to be, that means basically what's going on is there's two sides of the coin. Am I going to say that zrika is much more lenient? That even if you have kula arelim, which means everybody that they're going to be considered arelim, it's not going to disqualify. But by shchita, which is more stringent, even if it's going to be some of them which are arelim, it's going to disqualify. Or do I go the other way around? That by the shchita, right, even if it's going to be kula ola, right, it's not going to disqualify. But by zrika, even if it's miksata, it's going to disqualify. And if you're going to tell me what is zrika, that the same halacha will apply to the zrika, kula ola lo pasada, it's not going to disqualify. Tamulomar zot. What does zot teach you? Shchita u de miksata lo pasla. The shchita, it's the miksata, it's not going to be disqualifying. Aval zrika, filu miksata pasla. But by the zrika, even a little bit of it is going to disqualify it. And now if you're going to tell me my chumra de zrika, what's the chumra of zrika? Te lo mikva pigul ela bizrika. So the chumra by zrika is that it's not going to become pigul unless it's done during the time of the zrika. Which means if a person is going to think about in other things, it doesn't become pigul, right? The only time that it becomes 100% pigul is by the zrikat adam, right? Because until then, right, you could still say that you could still fix it, but by the zrikat adam, the sprinkling of the blood, that's when it makes it into pigul. Okay, so that's why according to the shita, the zrika is much more stringent than shchita. So matkif la Ravashi comes and he asks the following question: how do you know v'chol arel means everyone? Everyone is arelim. Everyone is without circumcision. Dilma v'chol arel, maybe it's only a few of them. The Torah says zot, kula ola lo pasad. Until it's everybody, it's not going to disqualify. And there's no difference between shchita, no difference between the zrika. Ela Ravashi, but rather Ravashi says that Rav Chasta v'Rabba behakra mikami palge. They're arguing on another pasuk. V'nitza lo lechaper alav. What does it mean? We're on Samech Bet Amud Aleph. What does it mean? V'nitza lo lechaper alav, to have an atonement for it. Alav ve'lo al chavero, on that korban and not on another korban. And then again, we'll continue B'ezrat Hashem tomorrow.